The passport fell out of an old shoebox while I was cleaning our attic on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I almost tossed it aside with the other random documents David had stored up there, but something made me pause and flip it open. David Mitchell, born March 15, 1985, issued in 2013. The photo showed my husband's face, maybe a little younger, but unmistakably him. What struck me as odd was that this passport had expired years before I'd even met David, and he'd never mentioned having an older one. I sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, holding the document under the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. David had always been vague about his past, claiming he preferred to focus on our future together rather than dwelling on what came before. I'd found his philosophy romantic when we were dating, refreshing even, compared to other men who'd bored me with endless stories about their college days and ex-girlfriends. But looking at this passport, dated from a time he'd never mentioned, I felt the first stirring of something I couldn't quite name. Downstairs, I could hear David making dinner, humming the way he always did when he cooked. We'd been married for exactly 2 years and 3 months, and I thought I knew everything about the man who shared my bed, my dreams, and my bank account. He was David Mitchell, a freelance IT consultant who'd moved to Portland from somewhere back east. He was quiet about his family, claiming they'd been distant since his parents died in an accident when he was in his 20s. He had no siblings, no close friends from before we met, no college roommates who visited or called. I'd never questioned his isolation because I'd fallen so completely in love with the mysterious gentle man who'd literally bumped into me at a coffee shop 3 years ago. He'd been carrying too many laptops and dropped one right onto my foot. His apologies were so genuine, his embarrassment so endearing, that I'd agreed to let him buy me coffee to make up for the bruise. That coffee turned into dinner, dinner turned into weekend trips, and before I knew it, we were married in a small ceremony with just my family present, since David had no one to invite. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled out my phone to Google, David Mitchell born 1985. The search results made my blood run cold. The first link was an obituary from the Portland Tribune, dated September 23, 2014. David Christopher Mitchell, 29, died tragically in a single-car accident on Highway 26 during an unexpected snowstorm. He was driving home from his job at Pacific Northwest Technology when his vehicle slid off an icy overpass. David is survived by his parents, Robert and Margaret Mitchell of Bend, Oregon, and his sister Jennifer Mitchell Torres of Seattle. I read the obituary 3 times before the words fully registered. David Mitchell had died in 2014, 3 years before I'd met the man I married. The photo accompanying the article showed a face that was similar to my husband's but distinctly different. Same general build, same hair color, but the facial structure was subtly wrong. The nose was wider, the jawline softer, the eyes a different shade of brown. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through more search results. There was a Facebook memorial page with dozens of posts from friends and family mourning David's loss. Photos showed him at college graduation, family barbecues, hiking trips with friends who clearly loved him. This David Mitchell had been a software engineer at Pacific Northwest Technology for 6 years before his death. He'd been dating someone named Sarah Chun for 2 years, and had apparently planned to propose. I found more links. LinkedIn profiles, professional articles he'd written about cybersecurity, even a local newspaper feature about his volunteer work teaching coding to underprivileged kids. This was a complete life. A full human being with connections and accomplishments and people who missed him. And according to every official record I could find, this David Mitchell had been dead for 10 years. Luna? Dinner's ready. David's voice called from downstairs, the same warm tone I'd heard every evening for over 2 years. I looked at the passport in my hands, then at my phone screen showing the obituary, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of reality. The man downstairs making dinner, the man who'd held me through food poisoning and anxiety attacks, the man who'd promised to love me forever, was using a dead person's identity. I managed to compose myself enough to join him for dinner, studying his face as he talked about his day working on a new client's network security. Every gesture, every expression, every laugh was familiar and dear to me, but now it all felt like a performance. Who was this person I'd married? Where had he gotten David Mitchell's identification? And most terrifyingly, what had happened to make him need a dead man's identity? "You're quiet tonight," David observed, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Everything okay? I forced a smile and told him I was just tired from cleaning the attic. He squeezed my fingers gently, the same loving touch that had comforted me countless times before, and I had to suppress the urge to pull away. The man I loved was sitting right in front of me, but David Mitchell was buried in a cemetery somewhere. That night, after David fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and planning my investigation. I couldn't confront him directly, not yet. I needed to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. Was he dangerous? Was he running from something criminal? Or had he simply stolen the identity for financial reasons? Were there other wives, other lives, other deceptions I hadn't discovered yet? The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in months and drove to the main library downtown. I needed to research without leaving digital traces on our shared computer at home. The reference librarian helped me access newspaper archives and public records databases. What I found painted an even more confusing picture. The real David Mitchell had been an only child, not the middle son my husband claimed to be. His parents were very much alive and still living in Bend, running a small accounting firm together. There was no record of the car accident my husband described that had supposedly orphaned him. The real David had graduated from Oregon State University with a computer science degree, while my husband claimed to be self-taught and had always been vague about his educational background. Most disturbing was what I found about David's death. The accident had occurred on September 23, 2014, but the body had been so badly burned in the resulting fire that identification was made primarily through dental records and personal effects found in the car. The funeral had been closed casket. There were no surviving photos of David from the accident scene, and the police report was sealed due to an ongoing investigation into potential mechanical failure. I spent the afternoon reading every article I could find about identity theft and assumed identity cases. What I learned terrified me. Professional identity thieves often targeted people who died in accidents where the body was difficult to identify. They'd steal personal information before the death was widely reported, then use that information to establish themselves in new locations. The most sophisticated criminals would spend months or even years building up the stolen identity before disappearing from their previous life entirely. By the time I drove home that evening, I'd formulated a plan. I needed more information before deciding how to proceed, but I couldn't let David know what I'd discovered. I would have to continue playing the loving wife while secretly investigating the man I'd married. The thought made me sick, but I forced myself to smile when he greeted me at the door with a kiss and asked about my day. Over the following weeks, I became an expert at deception. I searched through David's belongings when he was out, looking for any clue to his real identity. I found a small safe hidden behind books in his home office, but it required a combination I couldn't guess. I started paying attention to his phone calls, his computer usage, his daily routines, looking for patterns that might reveal something about his past. What I discovered was that my husband was remarkably careful about covering his tracks. He used encrypted messaging apps, cleared his browser history religiously, and never left documents lying around. His home office was meticulously organized, with nothing personal visible. Even his clothes had the tags removed, making it impossible to trace where they'd been purchased. But everyone makes mistakes, and 3 weeks into my investigation, David made his. He'd been on a work call in his office with the door closed, but I heard him say something that made my blood freeze. No, I can't use that name anymore. I've been Mitchell for almost 4 years now, and changing again would raise too many questions. There was a pause then. The wife doesn't suspect anything. She's not the suspicious type. I stood in the hallway outside his office, barely breathing, as my husband discussed his fake identity and his assessment of my naivety with someone who was clearly aware of his deception. When the call ended, I quickly moved to the kitchen and pretended to be loading the dishwasher. David emerged from his office with his usual smile, asking what I wanted for dinner as if he hadn't just been discussing how successfully he was deceiving me. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out who my husband really was, and I was going to make him pay for the lies he'd built our marriage on. But first, I needed help from someone who understood how to investigate identity fraud professionally. The next morning, I contacted a private investigator named Rebecca Torres who specialized in cases involving assumed identities and marriage fraud. Her office was in a nondescript building downtown, And when I explained my situation, she didn't seem surprised. "You'd be amazed how often I get cases like this," she said, taking notes as I described what I'd found. "The good news is that if someone is using a dead person's identity, there are usually records somewhere that can help us figure out who they really are." Rebecca explained that professional identity thieves often had patterns in how they selected and used stolen identities. They might have criminal records under their real names, outstanding warrants, or debts they were trying to escape. The most dangerous ones were fleeing serious criminal charges and would go to extreme lengths to protect their false identities. "We need to be very careful how we proceed," she warned. "If your husband is running from something serious, confronting him directly could be dangerous." We developed a plan to trace my husband's real identity without alerting him to our investigation. Rebecca would use her law enforcement connections to run fingerprints and facial recognition searches, while I would continue gathering information from inside the marriage. She also recommended I start documenting everything: financial records, daily routines, phone calls, anything that might be relevant if this case ended up involving law enforcement. The investigation took 6 weeks to complete, and what we discovered was worse than anything I'd imagined. My husband's real name was Marcus Chun, and he was wanted by the FBI for a series of investment fraud schemes that had cost victims over $3.2 million. He'd been using the David Mitchell identity since 2015, about a year after the real David's death. Before that, he'd lived as Thomas Anderson in California and Robert Stevens in Arizona, both identities stolen from men who died in accidents. Rebecca showed me a thick file of Marcus Chen's criminal history. He was a career con artist who specialized in long-term romantic deceptions. He would steal the identity of a dead man, move to a new city, and find a woman to marry who could provide him with financial stability and social legitimacy. He'd done it at least 5 times over the past 15 years, and in each case, he'd eventually emptied the woman's bank accounts and disappeared before she realized what had happened. According to the FBI profile, Rebecca explained, he usually stays married for 2 to 3 years before moving on. Long enough to gain complete financial access, but not long enough for the women to become too suspicious about his lack of family connections or personal history. I realized with horror that I was probably approaching the end of his timeline. He'd been David Mitchell for almost 4 years, married to me for 2.5. How much longer before he disappeared with everything I owned? The financial investigation revealed that Marcus had already begun transferring money from our joint accounts to offshore accounts I'd never heard of. Small amounts at first, disguised as business expenses or investment transfers, but the pattern was accelerating. In the past 3 months, he'd moved over $40,000 of our savings to accounts I couldn't access. At the current rate, he'd drain our finances completely within 6 months. But Rebecca had saved the most shocking discovery for last. "Luna," she said, pulling out a folder marked confidential, "Marcus Chun isn't just a con artist. He's wanted in connection with the death of his second wife, Patricia Anderson, in California. She died in what appeared to be a skiing accident in 2018, but the insurance investigation found evidence that her equipment had been tampered with. They believe Marcus murdered her to collect a $500,000 life insurance policy before disappearing." I felt the room spinning around me as the implications sank in. I wasn't just married to a con artist and identity thief. I was potentially married to a murderer who had killed at least one previous wife for money. The gentle, loving man who brought me coffee in bed every morning might be planning to kill me once he'd secured access to my life insurance policy. "What do I do?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Rebecca outlined our options. I could contact the FBI immediately and have Marcus arrested, but that would mean he'd know I'd discovered his identity before we could gather evidence about his future plans. Alternatively, we could work with law enforcement to set up a sting operation that would catch him in the act of planning whatever he intended to do next. The FBI agent assigned to the case, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, explained that they'd been tracking Marcus Chun for 3 years without success. He was careful, intelligent, and had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement by constantly changing identities and locations. Having someone on the inside of his current operation was an unprecedented opportunity to finally capture him. "We want to wire you with recording equipment and have you try to get him to discuss his plans," Agent Walsh explained during our first meeting. "If he's following his usual pattern, he's probably already planning his exit strategy. We need evidence of premeditation for the financial crimes, and if he's planning anything violent, we need to know before he acts. The next phase of my life became an elaborate performance. I continued playing the loving, unsuspecting wife while wearing recording devices and trying to gather evidence of Marcus's criminal plans. It was terrifying and exhausting, but I was motivated by the thought of the other women he'd deceived and the wife he'd possibly murdered. The breakthrough came during a dinner conversation 6 weeks after I'd started working with the FBI. Marcus had been drinking more than usual, and I casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about increasing my life insurance policy. It just seems responsible, I said, especially since you're self-employed and our income can be unpredictable. Marcus's eyes lit up in a way that made my skin crawl. That's actually a great idea, he said. How much were you thinking? I suggested doubling my current policy from $200,000 to $400,000, and he enthusiastically agreed. We should both increase our coverage, he said. You never know what might happen. Over the next few days, Marcus became increasingly interested in my daily routines and activities. He asked detailed questions about my hiking schedule, my driving routes to work, and my weekend plans. He also started suggesting activities that seemed designed to put me in potentially dangerous situations. Skiing trips despite my limited experience, rock climbing excursions, long hikes in remote areas. The recording equipment captured him making phone calls about timing and logistics with someone who was clearly helping him plan something. In one particularly chilling conversation, I heard him say, "The insurance has to be active for at least 90 days before any accident. We need to wait until March. Then we can proceed with the Colorado plan." Agent Walsh explained that the Colorado plan likely referred to a staged accident in a remote location where my body might not be found immediately, making it easier to collect insurance money before questions arose. The FBI was building a comprehensive case, but they needed Marcus to take more concrete steps toward implementing his plan before they could arrest him. The waiting was the hardest part. Every morning I woke up next to a man who was planning to murder me, and every evening I had dinner with someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial opportunity. I had to maintain the facade of loving him while knowing he was calculating the best way to kill me. The psychological toll was enormous, but I was sustained by the thought that my evidence would prevent him from hurting anyone else. The end came in March, exactly when Marcus's recorded conversations had predicted. He suggested a romantic weekend getaway to Colorado, a remote cabin near some hiking trails he'd found online. "It'll be perfect," he said, showing me photos of a rustic lodge surrounded by wilderness. "Just us, no cell service, complete privacy." I agreed enthusiastically, while the FBI prepared for his arrest. The plan was to let him think everything was proceeding normally until we reached the cabin, where agents would be waiting. They wanted to catch him at the location where he planned to commit murder, with all the evidence he'd prepared for staging my accident. The drive to Colorado took 6 hours, and Marcus was more talkative than he'd been in months. He kept asking if I told anyone where we were going, confirming that I'd left my phone at home as he'd suggested, making sure no one would be looking for us if I disappeared. Every question was designed to ensure that my death would go unnoticed long enough for him to collect the insurance money and disappear. When we arrived at the cabin, Marcus excused himself to check the hiking trail conditions, while I unpacked our bags. What he didn't know was that the FBI had been monitoring the location for 3 days, and agents were positioned throughout the surrounding forest. When he returned 20 minutes later, he had a small backpack with him that hadn't been in our car. "I found the perfect trail for tomorrow," he said, his eyes bright with anticipation. "It's challenging, but the views are supposed to be incredible. Very secluded. Perfect for photography." I agreed that it sounded wonderful, while wondering what equipment he'd hidden in that backpack, and exactly how he'd planned to stage my death. The arrest happened at dawn the next morning. I was pretending to sleep when I heard the cabin door open quietly. Marcus was trying to slip out early, probably to set up whatever trap he'd planned for later in the day. FBI agents surrounded him before he made it 50 feet from the porch. I watched from the cabin window as they handcuffed the man I'd been married to for over 2 years. He looked confused at first, then angry, then resigned. When Agent Walsh told him they had recordings of him planning to murder me for insurance money, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The career con artist had finally been caught. The trial lasted 4 months and revealed the full scope of Marcus Chen's criminal career. He was convicted on 17 federal charges, including identity theft, fraud, marriage fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence I'd helped gather was crucial in establishing premeditation and connecting him to previous crimes in other states. Patricia Anderson's case was reopened, and with the new evidence from Marcus's recorded conversations, investigators were able to build a case for her murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree murder in California and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, I gave a victim impact statement that I'd been working on for months. Marcus Chen stole more than David Mitchell's identity, I told the court. He stole 3 years of my life, my ability to trust, and my faith in the fundamental honesty that marriage requires. But most importantly, he stole the life of a good man whose identity he used to deceive and manipulate innocent women. The judge sentenced Marcus to 25 years for the federal charges, to run consecutively with his life sentence in California. He would die in prison, never again able to assume someone else's identity or destroy another woman's life. After the trial ended, I met with the families of Marcus's other victims, including David Mitchell's parents. They thanked me for bringing their son's identity thief to justice and helping them finally have closure about who had been using David's name. We established a foundation to help other victims of identity theft and marriage fraud, ensuring that Marcus's crimes would ultimately help protect other people. 5 years later, I'm remarried to a man whose background I verified through 3 different investigation services before our second date. My new husband understands my need for absolute transparency and has never questioned my requests to verify details about his past. Trust, once broken by someone you love, requires different foundations the second time around. Marcus Chen spends his remaining years in maximum security prison, where he can't steal anyone's identity or plan anyone's murder. The man who thought he was clever enough to kill me for insurance money. Marcus Chen spends his remaining years in maximum security prison, where he can't steal anyone's identity or plan anyone's murder. The man who thought he was clever enough to kill me for insurance money discovered that some women are too smart to be victims twice. Sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure the person who tried to destroy you can never hurt anyone else again. I didn't just survive Marcus Chen. I made sure he would never survive another identity theft again.